It was a bright, sunny morning in Los Angeles, and Sarah Jenkins couldn't help but smile as she looked around her lavish exhibition. Today was the day she had been dreaming of, her own private show filled with VIP guests from the design world, industry leaders, and all the people who mattered. Every inch of the art gallery sparkled with perfection. Sarah had worked tirelessly for this moment, and now it was here. Sarah Jenkins was a renowned interior designer, admired for her impeccable taste, creative flair, and most importantly her ability to get noticed. Her name was synonymous with luxury, class, and sophistication. But today wasn't just about the art on the walls or the stunning furniture on display, it was about Sarah herself. She was in the spotlight as she always was, surrounded by guests eager to discuss her latest work and shower her with praise. The guests, dressed in designer clothes and with their faces adorned by polite smiles, mingled and admired Sarah's talent. But as Sarah moved from one group of people to another, all she could think about was the one person who was always with her, her husband, Mark. Mark Jenkins, standing alone at the back of the room, was a stark contrast to the glamorous world Sarah inhabited. Unlike Sarah, who thrived in the limelight, Mark was a freelance photographer who preferred a quiet, low-profile life. His simple jeans and t-shirt didn't stand out among the crowd, and his reserved nature made him blend into the background. While Sarah basked in the attention, Mark remained unnoticed, like a shadow lurking in the corner of the room. He had always supported her career, quietly and without question. It was almost as if he had accepted his place in her world, always secondary, always behind the scenes. But today, as he stood at the edge of the party, feeling invisible as usual, something inside of him stirred. For once, Mark wished he could step out of the shadows. He had always loved Sarah, but the lack of acknowledgement from her had begun to wear on him. He had been there for every exhibition, every press conference, every moment of success. Yet, every time Sarah reached new heights, he felt more and more like a distant figure in her life. Sarah, on the other hand, had no time to notice the tension that was brewing just a few feet away from her. She was too caught up in making small talk with the latest guest, an influential designer whose praise was exactly what she needed to feel validated. She smiled brightly and laughed, her words carefully crafted to leave the right impression. She didn't need to look over at Mark, not right now, not with everything going so perfectly. Why should she? The world was at her feet. As the conversation around her continued to swirl, Mark quietly approached her, trying to find a moment of connection. He gently tapped her on the shoulder, and Sarah turned to face him. He gave her a soft smile, one that was full of warmth but also tinged with sadness. "Sarah, you look stunning tonight. Congratulations on the exhibition," Mark said, his voice calm and steady. Sarah turned her head toward him and gave him a faint smile, her lips curving slightly, but her eyes never fully meeting his. She gave him a quick nod and then, almost without missing a beat, shifted her attention back to the group she had been speaking with. "Thank you, Mark," she said in passing before continuing her conversation. Mark stood there for a moment, a quiet pang of disappointment settling deep in his chest. It wasn't the first time Sarah had brushed him off like this, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But today, for some reason, it stung more than usual. Perhaps it was because he had tried so hard to be there for her, always in the background, always supporting. Yet, all he ever received in return was her fleeting acknowledgement, as if his presence didn't matter. He watched her with a growing ache, but he didn't say another word. Instead, he took a seat in the corner of the room, sinking deeper into the shadows where he seemed to belong. From there, he observed as Sarah continued to entertain her guests, her laughter ringing out and her every move calculated to perfection. She was the star of the night and everyone else was just part of the backdrop. In that moment, Mark realized that this was the life she wanted. This was the world she had built, a world that didn't need him. She had risen to the top, and she had done so without him being part of her success, aside from the quiet sacrifices he had made along the way. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Mark had swallowed it for years. As the night stretched on and the party continued to swell, Mark remained in his corner, silent and still, his thoughts heavy with the weight of his own self-doubt. He had always been Sarah's support, but in truth he wasn't sure if she needed him anymore. His role in her life felt more like that of a forgotten accessory, something that once had a place but now seemed redundant. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the gallery windows. The light flickered across the polished floors and Mark's mind wandered. He wondered if this night, this celebration of Sarah's success, would be the last time he would ever stand silently in the background. He wondered what it would take for him to finally step out of the shadows and be seen for who he truly was. The evening was far from over, but for Mark, the path ahead seemed uncertain. He had always been patient, always been the quiet one, but something in him was shifting. He could feel it. And though he didn't know it yet, that night would be the beginning of a dramatic change in his life. A change that, in the end, would shake the foundation of everything Sarah had worked so hard to build. As the evening stretched on, Sarah's exhibition continued to shine with all the grandeur she had worked so hard for. The buzz in the air was palpable, filled with lively conversations, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. The spotlight was squarely on her, where it always was, and it felt just right. Sarah thrived in this atmosphere, surrounded by people who admired her talent and success. Yet even as she received compliments and accolades, there was one person in the room who couldn't escape her periphery, no matter how much she tried. Mark remained in his corner, watching, silent. It was as if he had become part of the furniture, just another piece in the background that everyone ignored. Sarah, wrapped up in her world of admiration, didn't even glance in his direction anymore. She was too busy basking in the praise of an up-and-coming architect, one who seemed equally enamored with Sarah's work and, more importantly, her charisma. Mark felt the familiar knot in his chest as he observed the situation. This wasn't new to him. He had seen this pattern play out countless times. Sarah was always the center of attention, while he was just the quiet, unnoticed husband. It wasn't as though he hadn't come to terms with it over the years. After all, he had chosen to support her from the shadows. But tonight, for some reason, it felt different. Maybe it was the fact that her success seemed so far removed from his own, or maybe it was the overwhelming realization that her life was no longer a life they shared. It was a life she lived on her own, with no real need for him. Mark's hands rested on his lap, the cold glass of wine untouched beside him. He had been here for hours, but it felt like days. He didn't care to mingle. He didn't need the praise of strangers. All he wanted was a simple acknowledgement, a moment where Sarah would look at him and say, "Thank you for everything." But that never happened. At one point, Sarah's laughter rang out across the room, drawing the attention of every person nearby. Mark, unable to ignore it, glanced over, his gaze landing on her as she spoke animatedly with a group of people. She was perfect, flawless, glowing, the embodiment of success and grace. But there was a sharp pang in Mark's chest, one that twisted with each passing second. She was dazzling, but for some reason it no longer felt like a shared triumph. It felt like an achievement he had no part in. Finally, Mark stood up, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. He needed air. Maybe some space would help him sort through his thoughts. He made his way toward the balcony, feeling the cold night air brush against his face as he stepped outside. The city of Los Angeles stretched out before him, its lights twinkling like a sea of stars. He took a deep breath, the coolness of the evening doing little to calm the storm inside him. He leaned against the railing, looking down at the street below, his thoughts tangled. He had been patient for so long. He had given Sarah everything she needed to build her career, and in doing so, he had sacrificed his own. He wasn't resentful of her success. He loved her too much for that. But something inside him was starting to break. The realization that he had faded into the background of her life was more than he could ignore now. He was a spectator, nothing more. And it hurt. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his reverie. Mark pulled it out and saw a message from his lawyer. His pulse quickened as he read the short, simple text. All set. Everything's in motion. The words hit him harder than he expected. It was a reminder of the plan he had set into motion earlier, an idea that had started as a whisper in the back of his mind but had grown into something far more serious. Mark had made a decision. He wasn't going to sit quietly by anymore. He wasn't going to let Sarah's world continue without him taking control of his own destiny. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt a surge of power, of clarity. He wasn't just the man in the background. He wasn't invisible. And he wouldn't be anymore. The game was about to change, and Sarah would finally realize that there were consequences for the way she had treated him for so long. As Mark stood there watching the lights of the city below, he knew he had to act. He couldn't just keep being the silent observer. His next move was already planned. He just needed the right moment to strike. Back inside the gallery, the night carried on without a hitch. The guests were in high spirits, and Sarah remained the center of attention, smiling and laughing with each new arrival. Her eyes sparkled with the thrill of being admired, the applause feeding into her need for validation. She was everything she had worked so hard to become, successful, recognized, and untouchable. But all the while, Mark stood outside, his mind racing with thoughts he had never fully entertained before. The text from his lawyer had set something into motion inside him. He had kept his silence for far too long. As Sarah reveled in her moment, Mark felt the cold weight of his own decision pressing against him, and though he was conflicted, he knew deep down that it was the only way forward. Inside, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the message, her lips curling into a sly smile. It was from Ethan, the young, charismatic architect she had been seeing behind Mark's back. Their relationship was a secret, one that Sarah had carefully guarded. Ethan was someone she could turn to for both professional and personal validation, someone who understood her world better than Mark ever could. Sarah had always been able to manipulate situations to suit her needs, and Ethan was no exception. He was ambitious, charming, and more than willing to play along in the charade she had created. "Ethan, I'm here. Let's make an entrance." Without hesitation, Sarah tapped out a quick reply and slipped the phone back into her bag. She turned back to her conversation, her mind already preoccupied with what was to come. A part of her relished the idea of Ethan arriving and causing a scene. It was a game she had played many times before. Make an impression, show everyone she didn't need Mark. The attention of others, especially the guests here tonight, was the fuel that fed her ego. A few minutes later, the door to the gallery opened, and in walked Ethan, tall and handsome, exuding an effortless confidence. He caught Sarah's eye almost immediately, and with a playful grin, he made his way through the crowd, heading straight for her. The murmurs of the guests faded slightly as they took notice of the unexpected visitor. Sarah's face lit up as she greeted him, her voice laced with a flirtatious tone. "Ethan," she purred, her arms opening to welcome him. "I'm so glad you could make it." Without a word, Ethan closed the distance between them, leaning in to kiss her deeply. The kiss was long, passionate, and public, unapologetically so. The guests around them fell silent, watching in stunned disbelief. Sarah held the kiss for a moment longer than necessary, savoring the attention, the shock value, and the validation it brought her. Mark, who had just stepped back into the gallery from the balcony, froze. His eyes locked onto the scene unfolding in front of him. The sight of Sarah and Ethan in such an intimate, public moment was more than he could bear. The weight of betrayal crashed over him in an instant. His pulse raced, his heart pounded in his chest. It wasn't the kiss that hurt, it was everything it represented. For years, Mark had silently supported Sarah, watched her rise to fame and cheered her on from the sidelines. But in that moment he saw the truth. He had never been a part of her success. He had been a bystander, an accessory to her story. And now she was flaunting her new younger lover for the world to see. He wasn't just irrelevant, he was expendable. The room buzzed with whispers as Sarah pulled away from Ethan, giving him a sly smile. She looked around at the guests, letting them all see her in the company of someone who was clearly more important than her quiet, unnoticed husband. The gesture wasn't lost on anyone. It was a calculated move, one meant to show that she was powerful, independent, and, most importantly, free from the constraints of a man who had no place in her world. Mark's vision blurred, his head spinning. He stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. His breath came in shallow gasps as he processed what he had just witnessed. Sarah didn't even look at him. She didn't need to. She had everything she wanted. The bitterness and humiliation settled into his bones like a cold, hard weight. Mark had seen enough. He didn't need to be part of this world anymore. He didn't need to suffer in silence while Sarah played her games. But the anger inside him was calm, controlled. There was no need for an outburst. He had made up his mind. His response would be calculated, just like Sarah's. No more silence, no more being invisible. It was time for her to understand that there were consequences to her actions. As he turned away, making his way through the crowded gallery toward the back exit, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few swift taps, he dialed the number of his lawyer. "Do it," Mark said, his voice steady, devoid of any emotion. "It's time." Mark walked through the quiet hallways of the gallery, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The sounds of laughter and music faded behind him, but the heavy weight in his chest refused to lift. The public betrayal he had just witnessed stung deeper than anything he had ever experienced. Yet even as he struggled to swallow the bitterness, a sense of resolve began to take over. His emotions, though raw, were under his control now. He knew what had to be done. The time for silent suffering had ended. Mark stepped out of the gallery, the cool night air hitting his face with a sharp, refreshing gust. He didn't bother to look back. The exhibition, the guests, Sarah, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was that he had a plan and it was finally in motion. His phone buzzed again in his pocket. Another message from his lawyer. "Lawyer, everything is in place. We can move forward at any time." The words felt like a final confirmation of what had been slowly building in the background for weeks. Mark had spent months preparing for this moment. The lawyer had been his ally for some time, quietly gathering evidence, making connections, and ensuring that every move was perfectly timed. The decision to strike wasn't an easy one, it never was, but Mark had reached the point where he could no longer stay in the shadows of Sarah's life. His silence had been misinterpreted as weakness. Now it was time for her to understand what it truly meant to betray him. As he read the message, Mark's thoughts shifted to the quiet conversations he had had with the lawyer. They had discussed his options, the consequences, and the necessary steps. The legal strategy was clear. Leverage his connections, use his knowledge of Sarah's business dealings, and strike in a way that she couldn't ignore. He wasn't going to tear down everything she had built, but he was going to make sure she understood the consequences of taking him for granted. Sarah would learn that her world of glitz and glamour could easily unravel. Mark took a deep breath and replied to the lawyer's message. Mark, proceed. The decision was final. Sarah would learn the hard way that nothing, no matter how much money, power, or status one had, was untouchable. She had crossed a line, and now Mark would make sure she paid for it. The next few minutes felt like hours. Mark stood by his car, his hand gripping the cold metal of the door as he waited for the call to come. He had never been the kind of man who acted impulsively, but tonight was different. Tonight, he was no longer playing the role of the silent, invisible husband. He had taken control of his own destiny, and he wasn't going to look back. The phone rang. Mark, the lawyer's voice came through the line, calm and collected. It's done. Sarah's been fired. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The news hit harder than he expected. He had known this was coming, but hearing it confirmed made it feel real. In that instant he felt a strange mixture of relief and satisfaction. Sarah's world, the one she had spent years building, was beginning to crumble. Good, Mark replied quietly, though the word felt hollow. Keep me updated. He ended the call and leaned against the car, staring out into the city lights. He had known this would be the moment that changed everything, but the weight of it still felt like a heavy burden. He wasn't sure what would happen next or how Sarah would react, but he knew it would shake her to the core. Inside the gallery, Sarah was still basking in the glow of her evening, unaware of the storm that was brewing just beyond her reach. She laughed, her smile never wavering as she clung to Ethan's arm, showing off their display of affection for all to see. But the moment was fleeting like everything else in her world. Sarah, in her pursuit of power and validation, had underestimated the quiet strength of the man she had left behind. Mark had spent years silently supporting her, only to be left behind as she chased new distractions. But no more. It was time for Sarah to understand that her actions had consequences. Tonight, she would realize that the very foundation of her career, the connections, the accolades, the company she had built, had always been intertwined with Mark's influence. And now the rug was being pulled out from under her feet. The gallery was alive with energy, and Sarah was the undeniable star of the evening. Her laughter filled the air, a soundtrack to the many conversations swirling around her. Ethan, by her side, leaned in occasionally to whisper compliments and inside jokes that made her smile even brighter. The guests were captivated as expected. Sarah was on top of the world as she always had been, and tonight she was more confident than ever. She was untouchable, everything she had ever wanted was within her grasp. But as the night wore on, something began to shift. An uneasiness hung in the air, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. It was subtle at first, the whispers of a few guests who had heard about her sudden fall from the top in another context. Those murmurs about her rise and the business dealings she'd been involved in. She dismissed it all with a wave of her hand, too distracted by Ethan's flirtations and her own reflection in the praise she was receiving. But then at around 9 p.m., Sarah's phone buzzed in her bag. A message came through, the words sharp and to the point, "You've been fired." It was from her boss, the owner of the prestigious design firm where she had worked for years, the one that had helped elevate her career to the heights it had reached. The message was brief, blunt, and final, effective immediately. "We no longer require your services." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the message for a long moment, her mind struggling to process it. She quickly called the office, hoping there had been some mistake. Her hand trembled as she held the phone to her ear, but all she heard was the cold, professional voice of the receptionist telling her that the decision was final. There would be no negotiation, no further discussion. In the midst of her panic, her eyes scanned the room and she found herself looking toward Mark. But Mark wasn't there. She searched the crowd, her gaze frantically moving from one person to another. He had left the gallery hours ago, long before she received the news. She felt a strange, hollow sensation settle deep within her. It was as if the very air had thickened around her. The reality of the situation hit her like a slap in the face. The prestigious firm that had brought her fame, the connections she had worked so hard to cultivate, the recognition she had basked in, they were all crumbling in an instant. The phone call from her boss wasn't a coincidence. Mark had set this in motion. She had no proof, but she knew. He had been quiet for so long, always in the background, always patient. But this was his retaliation. Her mind raced as the reality of her betrayal sank in. She had spent years building her career on the backs of others, particularly Mark's quiet support, and now it was all slipping away. She had thought she was invincible, untouchable. But now it was clear. Nothing was guaranteed. Her eyes filled with panic as she stood at the center of the room, trying to compose herself. She couldn't let anyone see her falter. Not now, not with Ethan standing beside her. She forced a smile, but it felt brittle, fake, as if it might break at any moment. The laughter around her seemed distant, the chatter muffled. Her heart hammered in her chest as she tried to make sense of what was happening. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice strained. "I need to go. Something's wrong?" Ethan, who had been absorbed in the attention they were receiving, looked at her with confusion. "What's wrong, Sarah?" he asked, concern flashing in his eyes. But before she could answer, she spotted a familiar face entering the gallery, a face she had not seen in years. Her former assistant, someone she had left behind when her career had taken off, was walking toward her with a grim look on his face. "Sarah," the assistant said, voice low. "There's something you need to know. There's a report coming out about your firing, and about your business dealings. The firm can't protect you anymore." The words felt like a punch to the stomach. The weight of everything she had built came crashing down on her, and the tears she had been holding back finally began to slip down her cheeks. The humiliation was overwhelming. Her face flushed with the realization that her reputation, the very foundation of her career, was about to be destroyed. Sarah turned to Ethan, her voice a whisper. "I need to leave. Right now." Ethan, taken aback by her sudden shift in demeanor, nodded quickly, but he was clearly confused. As they made their way toward the door, Sarah's mind raced. What had she done? She had been so wrapped up in her success, in the thrill of the moment, that she had forgotten the one person who had always been there for her. The one person whose life she had carelessly disregarded. As the door closed behind them, Sarah stepped out into the cold night, feeling a wave of disbelief. Her career was crumbling, her marriage was in ruins, and everything she had worked for seemed to be slipping through her fingers. The thrill of the exhibition, the excitement of being admired, now felt like a distant memory. She was no longer untouchable. The walls she had built around herself had cracked, and now the reality of her choices, her betrayal of Mark, had come back to haunt her. The city lights of Los Angeles shimmered in the distance as Sarah stood outside the gallery, her thoughts a jumbled mess. The cold air bit at her skin, but it barely registered. The night had started with such promise. Her exhibition, the guests, the admiration. But now it all seemed like a cruel illusion. She had worked so hard for everything, and in a matter of minutes, it all began to unravel. The text from her boss, the sudden firing, the whispers about her business dealings, it all pointed back to one person, Mark. Ethan, who had been by her side through the chaos, tried his best to comfort her, though he clearly didn't understand the magnitude of what had just happened. He held her arm gently, his voice soft with concern, but Sarah barely heard him. Her mind was too busy processing the overwhelming feelings of betrayal, regret, and fear that now consumed her. She turned to him, her face pale and streaked with tears. "I need to go home," she said, her voice cracking. "I need to figure this out." Ethan nodded, though his brow furrowed in confusion. "Of course. We'll figure this out together." But as they walked toward his car, Sarah's thoughts drifted back to Mark. She hadn't seen him in hours. The last time she had even glanced in his direction, he had been standing in the corner of the gallery, almost like a ghost, silent, observing. But she hadn't thought much of it then. Now she realized just how wrong she had been. She remembered the moments she had dismissed him, the countless times she had taken him for granted. The way he had stood by her quietly through every success, every milestone, and she had ignored him, preferring the validation of strangers. The kiss with Ethan had been the final straw. She had paraded her affair in front of everyone, including Mark, without a second thought. She had never stopped to consider how he might feel, how it might hurt him. But Mark wasn't the kind of person to confront her directly. He was too quiet, too reserved for that. Instead, he had done something she never expected. He had taken control of his own destiny. She realized with a jolt that everything she had ever accomplished, the designs, the accolades, the reputation, had been, in part, a result of Mark's quiet influence. He had connections, people in high places, people who could make or break careers. And now it was all falling apart. Mark had played the game his own way, biding his time until he finally acted. He had waited for the moment when Sarah's success would blind her enough to make her forget the man who had been by her side all along. And now, she understood that it was him who had orchestrated her fall from grace. He hadn't done it out of malice. He had done it because he was done being invisible, done being the quiet partner who always stood in her shadow. The realization was almost too much for her to bear. She had always thought that she could control everything, that she could bend the world to her will. But in the end, it wasn't her career that defined her. It was the people she had pushed aside, the relationships she had sacrificed in the name of success. Back in the gallery, the evening had come to a close, and the guests began to trickle out, the once lively chatter now fading into a quiet hum. Inside the now empty room, only the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the space. Mark had already left. He had left Sarah to face the consequences of her actions, and he wasn't coming back. Sarah sat in the car, staring out the window as they drove through the quiet streets of Los Angeles. Ethan tried to speak, but she wasn't listening. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of Mark, of everything she had done to him, of the way she had taken him for granted. When they finally reached her apartment, Sarah stepped out of the car, her legs shaky as she walked to the door. She didn't want to be alone, but she knew deep down that this was the moment she had to face. She had lost everything. Her career was in jeopardy, her marriage was shattered, and the admiration she had sought for so long had crumbled to dust. She sat down on the couch, staring blankly at the walls, trying to make sense of it all. And then, for the first time in a long time, she realized something. She had been wrong. All these years, she had thought she was untouchable, that she could live in the glow of her success without consequence. But she had failed to see the one person who truly mattered, the person who had always been there for her, even when she hadn't deserved it. Mark had been her foundation, her quiet strength. And now, in the silence of her apartment, she realized that he was gone. He had made his decision, and it was final. The tears she had been holding back finally began to fall, but they weren't just tears of regret. They were tears of understanding. She had lost him, and this time there was no turning back.